I'm actually really excited to be making this video, not because coasters are some sort of epic, amazing project. It's going to be really cool. But for the last month, the shop's still in kind of disarray, but I've literally been renovating our shop, studio, and warehouse space to make more room for certain tools and areas for filming more content for our YouTube channel and for our social media accounts, as well as Make Epic Things, which is a sort of brand new business that we are launching that is related to crafted elements. So if you've actually here on YouTube and you want to go over to Make Epic Things, there are just a few videos there featuring my ugly mug right now, but I'm telling you, you're going to want to subscribe to that channel because there's some cool stuff coming up and there's some incredible giveaways, bigger than what we've done at Crafted Elements, which is going to be really cool. Anyway, today's video is going to be about coasters and specifically using our coaster molds. We have 5 molds currently at craftedelements.com. They're all silicone molds and they're going to be all for different purposes. I want to talk about them briefly right now. One of our original coaster molds is 25 by 5 by 1.5. It doesn't look like a coaster, does it? No, you can make a long board with this, like a long charcuterie board or breadboard, but you could also pour, 3/4 inch or inch thick wooden resin and then cut it up into 5 sections and have 5 by 5 coasters. One of our newer molds is 16.5 by 4. We have that 1/2 inch on that 16 side to make room for the kerf of the saw blade. So again, same deal as this guy, 16.5 by 4. You cut them up and you'll end up with 4 by 4 coasters. Now, onto our formed pre-shaped coaster molds. The first one we came out with for that purpose is this. It is a 4 by 4 by 1 and 4 of them. So you make 4 coasters, 4 by 4 by 1 inch, up to 1 inch deep. So if you're a resin artist, you can use this. If you're a woodworker who's combining wood and resin, you can use this. And you can make coasters up to 1 inch deep. Soon after that, we came up with this funky guy. This is a hexagon shaped one. Same idea, 4 coasters set, but these are hexagon shaped. And I think they're like 5.2 across by like 4.5 tall and then 1 inch deep. And then one of our newer guys is this beast. It is a 20 coaster mold. What the heck do you need a 20 coaster mold for? I really thought that. However, we had a customer come in with some custom tooling and they wanted us to make molds with their tooling, and they had a 50 coaster tooling, basically the master to make the silicone molds. And basically they're making promotional products with it. So they're taking like samples from what they make some like steel mesh type plating stuff, putting in resin and sending those out to their customers like promotional samples. So these coaster molds are actually been really, really popular amongst resin artists because you can use obviously solid resin in here if you've got thin wood, or laser cut wood. If you're laser cutting, say 1/4 inch plywood pieces, you can actually embed those right into solid resin here because these are 1/2 inch deep. I'm going to use our new hexagon coaster mold, and I'm going to actually make 2 coasters with wooden resin and then 2 in the same set with just resin, all the same color, just so it looks like the same set. But I'm going to take a piece of burl I have. I think this is like maple burl. I'm going to resaw it on the bandsaw to basically end up with like 3/4 inch pieces, and I'm going to pre-shape those wood pieces to fit in that mold. I'm going to pre-shape those pieces in this case using a template. We do have a template that matches this mold, so you can actually pre-cut your wood to fit exactly in there. We don't have templates for these guys because they're just no squares or rectangles. They're not hard to fit a 90-degree piece of wood into any of these molds, so we don't really have templates for those. We do have the template for the hexagon, so we're going to get started by resawing that wood, pre-cutting it to fit at least a couple of those coasters, and then we'll get to pouring. There is actually one important thing I do want to mention before we actually get this project started. I know I've been talking a lot, but just stay with me because this is actually really important. If you are working with wood and resin, you're combining wood and resin in these molds, there's one thing you need to consider, and that is planing them, if you're going to plane them or not. When I do this project, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to cut that burl to like 3/4 inches, even though I've got an inch here. I'm going to fill it to like basically that 3/4 inches of resin, let it set, then I'm going to come back and just do a clear layer so I don't have to plane these. Because if you've ever taken a small 4 by 4, 3 by 3, whatever it may be, even a 5 by 5 piece of wood and run it through like a shop planer, it's iffy. It really is. You're either going to succeed or it's going to eat it up or it's going to shoot it out the other side like 60 miles an hour. Those planers really aren't ideal for doing small pieces. There are ways around that. You could take a large board, you could 2-sided tape it or hot glue it or whatever. that's just more work. So if you are really set on making wood and resin coasters, it's probably easier to use one of these guys. Make one piece, plane it, then cut it into pieces. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to actually do both methods. I'm going to use this guy to make a bigger 5x5, 5 coaster, 5x5 set. And then I'm going to use this guy with wood and resin only, and basically the burl, to show you how we're going to take these out and just have finished coasters, no planing, very little sanding, whereas this guy is going to be more post-processing. All right, I promise that's the explanation. Just follow along with me. I promise this video is going to be useful, and it's going to help you decide which mold to use for which coasters you want to make, and hopefully give you some ideas of what you can make in the future. Let's get started. All right, clearly I can't resaw this as is because there's no way to run it through flat. So I'm just going to take this piece off so I have that flat surface that I can resaw. So I'm just going to adjust my bandsaw level and we'll get this going. Setting this up to resaw, I want to have roughly 3/4 inches, maybe a little bit more, because I'm going to be using these pieces in that hexagon mold. We've got our cut slices, 3/4 inch, and we've got our template to match that mold. So what we're going to do here, there's a couple of options. We can either use this template, basically glue it to here, or two-sided tape it, and then use our router table to perfectly finish those edges, or we can simply use it as a tracing template. I think today, for our purposes, I'm just going to really just trace this and make it so it's pretty darn close, that's for sure. We're just going to finish up, clean up these edges and the surface with some 150 grit. That's already on my sander, and then we'll be ready to put these in the molds. Okay, so we've pre-cut the pieces of burl with the assistance of our tracing or routing template to fit these molds, and I've also just gone to our little scrap wood pile, got a piece of live edge walnut, ran it through the planer to make it roughly 1 inch thick, and that will fit in here so we can do our coasters with that one as well. Now before we actually set our wood in there and get our resin going, we need to coat these with a mold release. These are silicone molds. If you just put epoxy resin in there without a mold release, you'll be lucky to get a couple of uses out of them before they start falling apart. Epoxy resin is really kind of harsh and abrasive to silicone. So you want to use something that a non-silicone based mold release. We regularly use the MG Chemicals 8329. There's other options. There's the Man Ease Release, Smooth On Universal Release. Really easy to apply this stuff. Put a respirator on if you're not doing this outside. You know, this can's like 35 bucks, 40 bucks, but honestly, it'll last a long time. You could probably do 40, 50 projects in these types of molds and get enough out of that. So now that that's sprayed, we need to leave that for about 5 minutes. But in the meantime, since we've got our wood pre-cut and our molds pre-sprayed, we can start mixing our resin. So I have here 2 different resins from Total Boat, which we frequently use. I've got Maker Epoxy, which is a Total Boat Just Crow product. It's really good for tabletop coating and very, very thin coats. However, I actually use it for casting if I'm casting small objects like coasters. It's really the volume you want to worry about and be considering when you're dealing with epoxy resin, not necessarily the thickness. If you have a small volume, you can do 1 inch thick in this stuff if it's easy, or make like a small casting. But if you were doing, say, like a big, charcuterie board or river table or something, you wouldn't want to do 1 inch of this. You'd end up with a disaster. However, for our bigger mold, we're going to go ahead and use Total Boat's thick set. It is a deeper mold and it's going to have much more volume, so we're going to avoid using the Maker Epoxy for that one. But I'm going to go ahead and mix this up. Now I know that each of these little pockets is like 9 ounces, and of course we have we're going to only be doing 3/4 inch full, so probably like 7 ounces per pocket, and then we've got our wood to consider. So really this is going to be an estimate. We have this, which is a 1-to-1, Maker Epoxy is a 1-to-1 ratio. We're just going to go ahead and mix 16 ounces of material for this guy, and that should be enough to do our hexagon coasters, and then we're going to go and mix the material for this guy. Now, whenever I do these projects for YouTube or social media, I always like to make them a little bit more colorful, a little bit more interesting. Maybe not something that everybody's going to be into. So what I'm going to do, thanks to our friends over at Black Diamond Pigments, who sent us this beautiful set of sample pigments, I'm going to pick my fire and ice combination, which is a combination I've used before, but it's like using essentially like a fired colored orange along with like a cool blue. Going to take half the epoxy resin, half the Maker Epoxy resin rather, roughly, and pour it in here just so I can mix up our pigment. Okay, we're ready for the fun part. So we're going to go ahead, put our pieces of wood into the mold. And if you've cut them correctly, they'll be super, super tight and you won't actually need to use anything to hold them down. So those are really, really tight. I don't think I'm going to need anything to weigh those down. I'm going to pour our blue here, just up to the top. I don't want to get over that wood because I don't want to plane these. So I just want enough to go right to the edge, and then I'll put the rest. We're going to do a solid resin coaster on this side. And then we're going to come and do our fire portion. Same deal, just up to the edge of the wood, or the top of the wood rather. I don't want to go over, because I'm going to come back tomorrow and I'm going to put a clear coat of resin on the top. Now for this guy, we're going to do something a little bit crazier. I always like the look of like light green, lime green color with that brown walnut. And I'm just going to put enough in there to get to maintain some translucency still. And before you make the comment that I should be wearing a mask, yes, I should be wearing a mask. I do have our big warehouse doors open and one of my fans on. But I can't really wear a ventilator and talk to you guys and explain what I'm doing. So in general though, if you're working with resin, any sort of solvent-based finishes and things like that, you'll want to wear a proper mask. All right, so I've got my green mixed up, just kind of a light, mostly translucent. And it's okay to over pour this because remember, this one we're going to run through the planer. So if you have a little bit extra, it's okay. Make a little bit of a spill. We got a little bit of corner here that needs filled. All right. So to prevent the wood from floating up like it is right now, you're going to want to use like an HDP block and a weight or a clamp from the side, and that'll be enough to hold it down. And remember, this piece of wood I just pulled out of our scrap bin. It isn't perfectly square on that side, which is fine because, you know, once we actually demold this, we're going to trim out the edges and then cut it in pieces and sand it and everything. So it doesn't really matter if the wood's really, really tight to the mold in this case. It does in this case, especially if you want to, you know, take them out and really do little to no post-processing. You do want to have a nice tight fit with your wood. But here, it doesn't really make a difference. An eighth, even up to a quarter will be fine because we're going to trim that off anyway. I'll use my propane torch or my heat gun to just quickly pop these bubbles as they pop up. So we're actually back later this day. About 7 or 8 hours have passed, so this is obviously not fully set and ready to demold yet. However, the material has solidified enough where it's really, really, really hard, but still kind of, you know, you could push on it to dent it, which means we can actually just go ahead and do our clear coat right now. That way it'll be ready to demold tomorrow afternoon, tomorrow night. I also decided to take the fire and ice theme a little bit further. The two coasters that I had poured earlier without any wood in them, obviously they're kind of boring just being solid resin. So I went ahead and I cut a snowflake to represent ice and then the black to represent fire on the orange background of resin. I painted them and then I inserted them into the mold here. So once we go over the top, it'll just, you know, give it a little bit more interest than just a plain blue or orange coaster. So I put these two pieces in a couple of hours back where the resin was definitely quite stiff, but it was still soft enough to be able to push these into the resin. Otherwise, if the resin had already solidified, you could use hot glue or probably super glue on the resin or even resin itself to adhere this. If you don't do that and you just pour this into it, you're going to end up with those pieces floating up and not getting the effect that we want. So you definitely need to make sure that they're going to stay down before you do this top coat. I'm going to go ahead and lay this down now. And don't worry about the bubbles, those are going to naturally dissipate, and we're also going to use our torch again to get rid of any surface bubbles that come to the top, just like we did before. And now the wood pieces, again, doing this top coat here so I don't have to run these through the planer and risk damaging them or having them shoot out the side of the planer. And I apologize if you can hear the music. The gym next door has their evening session in, so we've got some serious like 80s and late 80s, early 90s music. I don't usually complain about it because when I'm here not filming videos or doing shipping or making molds, I've got my music cranked up pretty loud 8 or 9 hours a day. So it's kind of a good trade-off. All right, so there we go. Quickly hit that with a torch, and again with these silicone molds, using a torch or a heat gun is okay, but if you're using a torch, you just really need to go quickly around the mold. You do not want to hold the flame to the side of the silicone, otherwise you will damage it. So if you can't, you know, get grasp on that, then just use a heat gun for this, but otherwise you're okay to use a torch. A couple of days have gone by and we are ready to demold both our sets of coasters. We've got the resin topped flood coated coasters, I should say, and they come out of the mold really, really nicely here. And partly due to the mold release, but that's what you get with these silicone molds, just like ridiculous ease of use. And that's ready to just give a quick cleaning. We can use that again. Now we did over pour some of the resin, so we're gonna need to trim this and do a very, very light sand. I'm gonna do that in a second. I'm gonna show you how we demold this guy. Taking off my weight, just go around the edges and detach this piece from the mold walls. And there we go. A nice clean mold ready to use again. And this we can now run through our planer and then chop up into pieces, which we're going to do in just a few minutes. However, I want to just go over quickly and give you some methods for removing this. You can bend them, you can sand them, you can use a little hobby knife. There's a bunch of different methods for taking off this excess resin. See, just by using my hobby knife here, I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but I've got that off. We're still going to go and sand the edges. The idea with these is that we wanted to have little to no post-processing, i.e. little to no planing and very, very little sanding, right? So that's the trick here. So these are basically all ready. I'm gonna take them over and then just do a really, really light sand with a high grit sandpaper. And then we'll probably just wet sand those edges to make sure that we have them nice and glossy. So I've got some 320 grit sandpaper on my hand sander, palm sander. And we'll just go and do these edges. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give those edges a really quick high polish sand or high grit sand. So I got a 1500 grit here, and I'm going to use, it's not actually wet sanding paper, but you can still wet sand with it to a reasonable limit. So I'm going to wet those just to get some water on the edges. And then I'm just going to go and hit them with this 1500 grit. On to our green and walnut coaster project. I'm going to go ahead and just take this HDP block off. I ended up putting quite a bit of resin over that wood, so that HDP block is on there pretty good. Get under there and just pry it off. So we can plane this first or trim off the sides and edges first. I don't know if it really matters. If my logic is if I go ahead and trim it first, it's just less mess for the planer to create. So because I didn't put that wood in really, really straight, I mean, not that I didn't put it in straight, but the wood itself was just my scrap bin. It was not level on the one side. So it's pretty tight there. It's got a big gap here. So what we're going to do is just take like a 1/4 inch off of each side. So this is a 5" by 25" piece. So once I take a 1/4 inch off each side, I'm going to end up with 4.5" coasters. And then I'll just cut 4.5 inches here to create the base coasters. So we're going to bring over to our table saw and trim it down to 4.5 inches. Now at this point, we've both trimmed the piece on the sides and planed the piece so it's level. However, when you're doing these coasters, I can either cut this up now and then sand them, or I could pre-sand these surfaces while it's all one piece. And I find it just more efficient to pre-sand this, at least initially, to get a lot of these planer marks off while it's still one piece, and then I can go and chop them in pieces. Sand this down to 150. Obviously we're going to have to sand this again once we actually cut them into coasters, but it's just going to make our job a little bit easier. I just pulled this piece out of the scrap pile, as you probably recall from the beginning of the video. So I've got this giant void here, and most of this is wood anyway. So instead of making 5 coasters out of this, which I definitely could because of its length, I'm just going to chop this section off, which is basically garbage, and make 4 coasters. So I'm going to do 4 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch coasters. That 1/2 inch, of course, is lost from the trimming that we did on the sides. Four coasters, ready for final finishing. I'm going to take them over to our router table. I've got a 1/4 inch round over bit here, which is going to give us a nice chamfer on all these edges, and then we can do our final sand. Okay, coasters are chopped into final sections. We've already had the chamfer around them. It's really just final sand and oil at this point. I'm going to bring out our 150 grit again. And obviously, sometimes in these videos I wear a mask, sometimes I don't. If I'm not wearing a mask, I've got my giant fans on and my warehouse door opening. I just want to say that because people are really critical when they're watching these videos, but it's hard to teach and talk and stuff while I'm wearing a giant ventilator. But if I can wear a ventilator, I will. Otherwise, you should always be wearing a mask or ventilator when you're working with resin, standing resin, or just working with wood, because you want to be breathing in those fine particles into your lungs. Let's get sanding. Time for everyone's favorite part. It's certainly my favorite part, which is the wood finishing stage. That's always the most satisfactory, most Instagram worthy part of doing these projects, is putting on oil and watching those colors and the grain pop. So we're going to go ahead and set these up in such a strategic way. I'm using my Total Boat Wood Honey. It's a great product. It's a mix of a few different oils and waxes, and it'll add a really, really nice food safe finish, and is obviously solvent free. So we're going to go ahead and apply that. And the easiest way to apply this is just rubber gloves and your hands. Not convinced that you actually even need to use rubber gloves with this stuff. I don't know its exact contents, but I would say it's probably all natural, and it'll probably make your hands just feel really, really nice and soft. But let's just say that for safety reasons, we're going to use rubber gloves when we apply this or any other mineral oil type based finish. All right, I've got a technique there. We're gonna let this set for about 10 minutes just so the oil can absorb into the wood. Come back and we'll rub it all off, and you can see the final product. A sufficient amount of time has passed here that we can just rub all this excess oil off and reveal our final product. I'm going to do a quick zoom in here so you can actually get a good look at these coasters, because they look super cool. Well, we just completed 2 sets of coasters with 2 different molds. We used our pre-formed hexagon shaped silicone mold for this set, and we use our kind of longer charcuterie board mold / coaster molds, cutting it up and then creating obviously 4 different pieces. We definitely could have used that 25 by 5 mold to make 5 different coasters had we selected a nicer piece of wood to begin with. Well, that's about it, folks. That's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it informative. If you want to grab your own silicone coaster molds just like these ones, head over to craftedelements.com now. Thank you for watching, and happy making.